Hi everyone, my name's Sarah. That was quite a good introduction. So I researched the Central Auckland Jewish community in the 19th century with case studies around Princess Street and Waterloo Quadrant. And I just asked what community this was and how they played such a crucial role in Auckland to have a beautiful big synagogue that's pictured in the background and to have a cemetery as well. So I asked questions of how did they establish a community identity in this new colony, who these immigrants were, how they became successful having lived in these villas, and was their community identity formed by Auckland and was Auckland shaped by them? And this is an image of Princess Street in 1880, and this is the site the synagogue was going to be built on. What I did find was a tight-knit Jewish community in this area, and I uncovered a story of religious sanctuary excellence in community. This is the 1841 to 46 census, and this is the first year that Auckland had a census, and there are 2 Jews in Auckland, including David Nathan. He was one of the first Jews in Auckland. The next year there were 13 Jews, so it rose 15 Jews and then 33 Jews. Within 10 years, it had more than tripled to 110 Jews, and in 1871 there were 309 Jews in Auckland. And it was always a very small percentage of the community. So how did they form community identity? Well, part of it was that they built it. A crucial something that was very important to them was to have enough people for worship. They needed 10 men to do public Jewish worship traditionally. They needed someone to lead it, possibly a rabbi, and they needed a place for public worship. And it was also important for them to have a cemetery and to have a school. So in 1842, the KEESING family arrived, which I had on the previous slide, when the numbers rose. So the KEESING family arrived. They were quite a big Jewish family. And that meant that was the first time that they attempted to do public worship. They apparently, due to the 1934 Jubilee speech, got together. They had 9 people, so they were one person short, but a stranger walked past and joined, which made the 10. In the 1840s and 50s, David Nathan's store on Shortland Street was used as the synagogue until in 1855 when they rented an Emily Place building and then bought it when the 7-year lease finished. In 1842, they applied for land in Jewish Cemetery and they were given land in Simon Street Cemetery. Their first burial was sadly the 6-month-old daughter of David Nathan, Catherine Nathan. That was 2 years later. The Emily Place synagogue when they started, they had a population of 110, but it quickly became too small and the layout wasn't perfect. The woman was sitting behind the men, whereas traditionally they would have a gallery above, which they had in the synagogue that they built in 1885, but they didn't have it at Emily Place. So they applied for land and they were given Alton Road Reserve, which is now called Constitution Hill. And that wasn't ideal because it meant that they weren't able to build a synagogue that was east facing, which is where the sun rises. The synagogues are normally built the sunrise, but they weren't able to do that. So they exchanged the land for where it is now in Princess Street. They also opened a Jewish school when they were still at Emily Place, and that was for 53 children. And then a school was built in the basement of Princess Street Synagogue. And their first rabbi, they didn't get until 1865. And so worship was normally led by someone in the congregation. And their first rabbi was Reverend Moses Arkin. And then after his resignation, Rabbi Goldstein came in 1880, and he would stay for 50 years until 1930. That's just a background of building the community. They had a cemetery, they had a school, they had somewhere to worship, they gained someone to lead the worship. So they gained all these things that allowed them to be successful in a colonial town. So now I want to go into introduce some case studies of the Jewish community that lived in Princes Street and Waterloo Quadrant and see how they experienced success in a colonial town. This is a 1886 map of Princes Street and Waterloo Quadrant. As you can see, this is Albert Park. These are the 5 merchant villas that are down Princes Street. And this is the synagogue. This is now University of Auckland, and this is Waterloo Quadrant down here. So the first house right next to the synagogue was 21 Princes Street, and the person that lived there was James SHARLAND, and he was a chemist. He built the house in 1878, and he lived there until his death. He was a chemist, and he owned Apothecaries Hall, which is pictured here in Shortland Street, and he also had a wholesale business. He was recorded to have bought the first drug supply to New Zealand. He was very successful as a chemist, and was seen as the best chemist in the colony because he became the chemist to successive governors of New Zealand. He wrote the popular 1878 book, The Settler's Guide and Household Companion, which was written for families that were living in colonial New Zealand that were outside of medical aid. So it was hints on how to stay healthy and kind of first aid. This is the house at 21 Princes Street. When he died, his wife's brother moved in with her, and his name was Philip Phillips. And he actually was the first mayor of Auckland, and he was later a town clerk. But he was also heavily involved in the Jewish congregation, and he was president and treasurer at different times. During his mayoralty, he actually saved the decommissioned Albert Barracks to become a park instead of being developed on. And so a plaque was placed in Albert Park, which stated that he was a man of vision who helped secure the land now known as Albert Park for the city. The family down the street was a Jewish family called the Davis family, and they lived at number 29 from 1885 to 1910. And this is a current picture of number 29. This is a 1908 exterior of the building taken from the street, and this is a 1908 interior while the Davis family were living there. So this is how their living room looked. This is Moss Davis. He was the father, Leah Davis, the mum, and this is their children. Moss Davis was a brewer and a hotelier. He owned the brewery Hancock and Company in the hotel, the Grand Hotel, Princes Street. He also owned Rotorua Hotels, which is where I'm from. Moss's business success, interestingly, was apparently due to Leah's business acumen, which is quite unique for the time to have a woman being labelled as having business sense. And they were believed to be a very religious family. This is an interesting picture of one of their daughter's weddings in 1900, and it's the wedding party. And if you look, you can see that this is number 29 they're standing in front of, and today it still has these arches. Next door, right next door, was Arthur Haying Nathan, and he was a merchant. He was a nephew of David Nathan, who was one of the first Jews to come to New Zealand. He was a merchant in general merchandise, but he also was involved in kauri and tea. And he had something called Arthur Nathan's Reliable Teas, which were unexcelled for quality, purity, and flavour, and packed in airtight lead foil packets, which was supposed to give his product an edge and keep them fresh. He lived at number 31 with his family from 1894 to 1905. He died. Interestingly, he was labelled by New Zealand Herald as a self-made man. He didn't come from as much family as other Jewish people did come from. So that is interesting. This is 31 Princes Street here. It's a beautiful building. He was also deeply religious. He was an honorary reader for the congregation in between rabbis, and he also taught the Hebrew school. He is buried in the Jewish section of Simon Street Cemetery. And then for Waterloo Quadrant was the KEESING family, and they were involved in retail and real estate. The house was sadly demolished in the 1960s, so I don't actually have a picture of it. So it was Henry and Rosetta and their multiple children, and they were Dutch Jews. They originally immigrated from the Netherlands to London before immigrating on to Auckland. And they bought for Waterloo Quadrant land in 1853. They owned London House, which was a profitable store, and it was one of the finest in settlement. It was quite a big retail store in Auckland. Henry was actually the first president of the Hebrew congregation in Auckland, and his son Ralph led first services. They were quite heavily involved. And both Henry and Rosetta are buried in Simon Street Cemetery in the Jewish section. So Barnett, their son, actually preceded the family to New Zealand. Henry KEESING arrived in 1842, and that's his name written in the census. And Barnett actually built one of the first houses in Auckland, and he sold lemonade and ginger beer to challenge growing alcohol sales. So this is a quote of reminiscences of early Auckland, and it says, among some of the first erections or makeshift houses, there was one put up for Barnett KEESING, in the shape of an Irish mud cabin where ginger beer was made and sold at 6p per half pint. And his sister Hannah, the daughter of Henry and Rosetta, married Asher, who was another early Jewish settler, and he was the first superintendent of the Volunteer Fire Brigade in 1848. Next to them was Rabbi Samuel Goldstein, and his house has also been demolished. He lived at number 6, which was the ministry house that was built when the synagogue was built. He lived there from 1880 to 1934, which is 4 years after he stopped being the rabbi. He was heavily involved in a lot of charities, so he's involved in the RSPCA, the Auckland Public Library Committee, comes up in a lot of their newspaper articles. And he was a founder of the Auckland branch of the Society for the Protection of Women and Children. And then this is a lovely quote of him from the 1931 Jewish Review. And it says, he has never spared himself in the service of the congregation. For 50 years, he has ministered to his flock with a spirit of joyous enthusiasm, with a genial optimism and a quiet spiritual strength that are characteristic of man. And this is him in the Princes Street Synagogue. Finally, there is David Nathan. He lived at 16 Waterloo Quadrant, and he was one of the first Jews to come to Auckland. This is his name written in 1841 census. His wedding to Rosetta was the first Jewish wedding in New Zealand, and their daughter's birth was the first Jewish birth. He built his home at 16 Waterloo Quadrant, and he named it Bella Vista because then you could actually see the harbour and the water from the house. Half of Curry gum trade was said to have gone through the Ferns and Nathans, and he also established the Auckland Hebrew congregation and cemetery. His Orthodox integrity and trustworthiness, so his Jewish Orthodox upbringing and his views of integrity and trustworthiness made him really popular in trade. So Māori who were looking to sell produce would often go to him, and British military who were looking to buy produce and goods for their regiments would also go to him. So that made him quite successful. He also bought one of the first lots of land in Auckland. His final public appearance was in laying the foundation stone for Princes Street Synagogue. So this is his home, Bella Vista, in 1863. It's now called Newman Hall, and it is right next to the law campus, if anyone's gone past it. So the community was quite successful for a few reasons, but this is a nice quote just to see how they interacted with each other within business. So Elliot Davis, the son of Moss Davis, said, in those days we were pretty closely connected with R.D. Nathans, the firm of David Nathans. His father sold them the right for an annual consideration to supply our hotels with wine and spirits. We were glad enough to get the benefit of the business acumen by selling them a half share in the Rotorua hotels. So the Jewish community often worked within business and used each other's businesses, which allowed money to kind of flow within that community. This is a photo of the Grand Hotel, which was on Princess Street. It's now just the facade, but it was owned by the Davis family. Another thing that was really interesting that I found was this idea of religious sanctuary in New Zealand, and it was quite a big step to success. This is a lovely, insightful quote of how Jews experienced coming to New Zealand, and it's by Violet Balkand in her 1928 master thesis, and it says, "The colony of New Zealand had been established on a basis of religious and political freedom. The social and cultural traditions of England were preserved, but any discrimination against any form of religious belief was discarded. From the outset, Jews shared fully in all the rights and duties of citizenship." So what I found was New Zealand was unique in that it didn't establish discriminatory laws. This was possibly a luxury to a colony where they had to work together to survive. They were still in a predominantly native population controlled area, so it wasn't particularly like relevant to be dividing people by religion. Supposedly the religions got on very well. David Nathan was reported to have put a brick in every chapel in the city, and the Jewish community recorded being cheered on by Christian clergymen when they looked to congregate for worship. What I also found is that the majority of Jews coming to New Zealand were from England, where they faced a lot of restrictions for their freedom because of their religion. David Nathan came to New Zealand in 1839, and only 9 years earlier, in 1830, were Jews of London able to carry out retail trade. So he came to New Zealand and he set up a tent in Commercial Bay and he sold from it. But only 9 years earlier were Jews really able to do that in London. Until 1845, Jews were unable to enter town councils, even though Auckland's first mayor, Philip Phillips, was Jewish. So Auckland's first mayor was Jewish, and yet in England, where they came from, it wasn't a thing until 1845. English law forbade Jews from owning horses. And it said that when the KEESINGs came, that was one of their first purchases, was buying ponies for their children. I also found that Jews in New Zealand followed along what was happening in England a lot. When in 1858 the law changed to allow Rothschild to enter Parliament without swearing an oath to the Christian Church, it was greeted with a special service and a letter of congratulations by the Auckland congregation. So Rothschild was voted into the government, and this is him here, actually when he eventually enters, but he wasn't able to enter without doing an oath to the Christian Church, which he refused to do. So it wasn't until 1858 that Jews were allowed to enter government. On the other hand, I also found anti-Semitism in the new colony, specifically a rally against Phillips becoming mayor, where he was called a mean, despicable Jew, and backlash about the possible immigration of 400 persecuted Eastern European Jews to New Zealand. What was interesting was that in both cases, there was a quick response against these sentiments. Before reporting on the rally, the Auckland Star apologised to readers for printing what was said, while a letter against the 400 Jews was challenged by another writer who claimed he failed to see why so much fear and agitation should be displayed. The houses on the merchant villas on Princess Street were actually going to face demolition in the 1970s until they were saved. This is actually a picture of the synagogue after it was deconsecrated and it became too small for the Jewish congregation and they moved to Grays Avenue. It was left. It reverted to ownership of the council, and it was left for about 20 years to just decay. So this is actually a picture in 1988 of it. I'm not looking its best until it was renovated. So I found that my research was really heavily based on physical built heritage, and yet a lot of this heritage was challenged. So that was quite surprising for me. This is a really nice quote from Nola Easdale in her Five Gentlemen's Residences in Princess Street, where she describes the kind of importance of preserving this heritage and preserving the Princess Street merchant houses. She says, 100 years since the houses were built, Now with their preservation, we today and in the future, perhaps in a leisurely moment as we walk by, can reflect on those who once lived there and in imagination repeople Princes Street with their shades.